I'm interested in your view, Kane, on the 275, because when Labor pledged that, essentially they were saying renewables are cheaper, here's what you'll save. Has that undermined support or confidence in renewables in terms of being a big part of Australia's future, because people now go, well, our prices went up, renewables must be no good? Has that done a disservice to people saying make renewables a bigger part of the economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly an unfortunate coincidence between the increase in renewables. We've about doubled the amount of renewable energy in Australia over the last 5 years, and at the same time, power prices have gone up. But I think what the modelling at that time didn't anticipate was the back end of a COVID crisis, the Russian war in the Ukraine. Indeed, now we're seeing Donald Trump and global tariff wars. These are all uncertainties that weren't known and understood at the time.
But should they have been recognised earlier? So midway through the term, Labor goes, well, look, all this has happened. The default market offer was delayed by the coalition. We're going to miss it. Here's why, rather than taking it all the way to the election, basically.
Look, I mean, I think at the end of the day, any piece of modelling is based on assumptions at a moment in time. And clearly, not long after, a bunch of assumptions changed, a bunch of global events occurred. In fact, a lot of those related to the price of gas and the role of gas in electricity generation. Chris made the point before that gas sets the price most often in the electricity market, and a lot of those factors therefore materially change gas market dynamics and prices here in Australia, and therefore led to those higher prices. None of that changes the reality that renewable energy was then and is today the lowest cost form of new generation, and therefore we should be pushing as much of it into the grid as possible.
Tanya, in terms of big users of power, do they just look at various promises, whether it be Chris Bowen's or Ted O'Brien's, and go, we're not convinced, prices will just keep going up?
Well, in terms of investment, we look at the input costs overall for a range of areas. Energy has gone up quite significantly for all businesses, and I talk to each of the companies, and it could be anywhere from 30% up 60% as the average across the industry, and that's not sustainable overall. When you have a single-minded plan, and I think that's what it is at the moment. And we support renewable energy. We're very forward-leaning on getting to net zero by 2050, and renewables needs to be part of that plan. But when you have a renewables-only solution, then there is only one assumption you can make, that energy prices are going to go up, and that's why we're saying a mix of energy is really important.
What about on nuclear? So Ted O'Brien was asked, if you lose this election, will you stop advocating for it? And to me, that's not so much a political question, it's actually a timeline, because it's a short runway already. If the coalition lose this election, can they take it to 2028, or is that getting too late to start this up? Because at some point it's going to be too late, right? This will take a while to get going.
Well, it depends on how you look at nuclear energy, and we look out to 2050 and we're reverse engineering into the period that we've got at the moment. The first thing you've got to do to bring nuclear energy on in Australia is to lift the ban on nuclear within the EPBC Act, because nobody is going to look at investment in Australia. But what will happen straight away is that we're now starting to see, Canada, United States are good examples, are micro reactors. So that's small amounts of nuclear energy that you can sit in a shipping container. That's the sort of thing that we would want to see on mine sites, because we need reliable heat.
So if that tech goes really well, it might even get to 2030 and then we can just suddenly adopt it.
Exactly.
The micro, not so much bigger builds, that might be harder to get into the system. But
well, I think you'd have that for the longer term, because you've got to have that reliable energy.
But Tom, could I jump in on that? Just because I find it interesting when we say, is it too late? As though we're almost at the finish line, we're almost done. We're actually just getting started. If you look at our energy mix today, it's still 90% fossil fuels.
But I guess it's around replacing that coal, because there's only so long you can extend the life of some of these plants. They will get less reliable, right?
Well, we need to be deploying, I think, all, in terms of electricity, all options available. We know every time you're taking options off the table, that tends to increase the cost and the challenge in terms of the transition. But we're also only talking here, and I noticed the debate, very much focused on electricity. We talk about energy, but we're actually talking about electricity. That's only part of the equation. What about industrial energy needs? What about industrial emissions, transport, agriculture in terms of the net zero equation?
Yeah.
You know, and we know that, you know, circumstances change over time. We can't predict what things are going to look like in 2 years, let alone in 15 years. And to be taking things off the table and options off the table because we think we don't need them is premature.